Identifying an attachment style that works for you and your spouse is the key to good communication. Learn how today on the Faithful and True podcast. Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, here again today with our host, Dr. Greg Miller, and our two special guests, Debbie Laaser, the founder of Faithful and True, and Beth Miller. Beth and Deb, of course, are both counselors of the wives that we help here at Faithful and True. Beth being the wife of Greg,
and who helps me,
who helps Greg.
She works with one husband.
And so, despite the fact that you think that today's podcast is on tolerance, it's really going to be our first program that we promised you about answering questions that we have received from you or from members of the women's groups or the men's group. In the case of today's podcast, Beth has brought us some questions that some of the women from her group have presented.
Well, thanks. It's good to be here. And so I have a couple of questions today, and let me start with the first one. This group member writes, one of the questions that I've been having is how couples can compromise when they have opposite needs in distress. My husband has avoidant attachment style, and I have anxious attachment style. When things are hard and we both feel distressed, I desire to draw close to him and connect and hopefully talk through things, and he wants to withdraw for a few days and have some time and space with no interactions. This feels difficult as I wait for him to be ready to talk things through. Is there a way we can compromise and meet in the middle? Great question.
Well, and one thing I hear is here is someone who has been doing a lot of work. She has a really good understanding of the situation, even this idea of attachment.
Yeah.
I don't hear judgment or criticism. It's just an acknowledgement that we are different, which is a great place to start, is that there is an acknowledgement that there's some differences there. But one of the things that we talk about here at Faithful and True is let's start with the similarities, not with the differences. Mm-hmm. So, as I hear that question, I hear probably both of them having a need to be heard and understood around a particular issue, and also a need to be safe.
Yeah.
Another similarity that I would say is just about every couple we work with here has a different attachment style. And this anxious or ambivalent style connected with the avoidance style is what we often see. So I want your client to feel normal. That's always nice, that I didn't marry the wrong person and I don't just have to find another person who could attach in the same way I do. Because the truth is, I think God brings together differences in a lot of different things, including attachment styles, so that we can learn from them, make changes in how we do life, and hopefully be able to become securely attached in our marriage, even though historically we've used these other forms of attachment.
I think when I think about this issue, even more globally, for a lot of couples, at the end of the day, what most of us really want is to feel safe. And I think one of the things that can be helpful is to understand how have I historically created safety for myself? And then how am I bringing those patterns, into my marriage? And some of that may be working, and some of that for us may be stuff that we have to explore and recognize that it's actually creating anxiety in the coupleship. Mm-hmm. And so I need to learn some different ways to keep getting underneath the iceberg, as we talk about here, down to how it is that I can be a safe person and create safety for my partner.
Well, and it's also this idea of needs. And so I have needs individually, and she identified that in these situations they have different needs. But what's also true is in the coupleship, my spouse has needs, and if I'm going to engage a coupleship, I need to be aware of my spouse's needs. But then there are also needs that just the coupleship itself has. So if my need is for space and I always move away from conflict, that's not going to serve my spouse and it's not going to serve the coupleship. So it's okay to say maybe initially I need some space, but ultimately my commitment is to move back towards the relationship so that we can navigate this. And she used the word compromise, and I think that's a valid term. I mean, we do need to compromise, but sometimes it's not so much about compromise, it is about navigation. That this topic has come up, we're having a strong reaction to it. Ultimately, we may be more similar than different, but in that initial reaction that we're having, how do we navigate that without creating more chaos for ourselves or for our spouse? And I think that starts with to the best of our ability, we clearly communicate what's going on for us and what we need, and then how we're going to respond in the future.
So I think what's true is that both of their attachment styles are not particularly healthy in terms of growing relationship. They've worked for you as an individual. You know, I would be the avoidant type of attachment where when things hurt or I'm not getting my needs met, I would pull away and pull into myself and find safety there. But the truth is that's a coping style also. And we use the word coping here to mean something that's not healthy. So as I grow in my own program, that means I'm going to learn other ways to come out of that place and to talk about things, figure out what I need, figure out what I need to be safe to talk about that, and then hopefully start eliminating that more and more and coming together and meeting with someone else. But the same is true with the ambivalent or anxious attachment style, that's not healthy either. It creates a lot of pressure in the relationship. The always pursuing, wanting to talk, asking a lot of questions, never being okay to go to bed until everything is resolved, that kind of person. That's not healthy either. And so that person in their own recovery program is hopefully learning other ways to manage that anxiety that's driving those behaviors. So perhaps the first thing I would recommend for her is for both of them maybe just to acknowledge that they each have ways of coping, that if they want to make this better for their relationship, they'll both need to work on their individual ways they cope, and perhaps that will best be done in their own counseling or their own community. And when they get triggered to a place where one of them is going into their extreme attachment style, that instead of staying there, they would reach out for some of the healthy tools we talk about, like get a counseling appointment, go talk with someone in your group about what's going on and figure out what you need, or go in for a couples session, because some of these triggering incidences are just so big you can't talk about them yourself. So to me, that would be where you would start changing the pattern that you have established.
I'm aware that we're talking a lot about attachment styles, and we're familiar with that, and obviously it's familiar to the person who wrote the question, but there may be people listening to the podcast that really aren't familiar with that concept. So is there a way just to kind of summarize what the attachment style theory is, or what it tries to help us to understand?
You want me to talk about
Yeah,
that?
I'd love for
I
you
don't
to.
know.
Yeah.
I probably could have brushed up a little bit on this.
Well,
Maybe just a broad
How about you,
principle.
Randy?
Well, there's one more option that I want to offer, and that's if you go to the faithfulandtrue.com website and go to podcasts and scroll through the audio podcast. We did 2 shows with Jim Farm and when Mark was still with us. So Mark and Jim did a couple of shows on attachment styles.
Okay.
And so I think that would be probably the best recommendation we could give for a really more in-depth explanation to what that means without putting you on the spot.
Well, I'll just talk very generally then.
Perfect.
And go back and listen to all that wonderful stuff.
Yeah, you give them the Cliff Notes version.
Cliff Notes is basically, through a lot of research and how children were raised at very early ages. Typically, the research came out of when children were, 0 to 5 years old, and how they were taken care of or not taken care of by primarily mothers in the original research, but we've come to believe that a father's influence is also incredibly important in whether a child comes out of that and begins to feel securely attached to adults. And when you're securely attached, you also start taking on some belief systems about your world and about yourself. One would be, I am worthy of being taken care of. So as a child, when you have a problem, or you're crying, or you're wet, or you're like your little Maria, if she needs some food, there's someone there who's addressing those needs. And if there are people, adults, caregivers, doing that on a regular basis, You can come out of that situation as you grow up believing, there are people here that care about me. I must be worthy and valuable to them. Also, another huge belief is that I can trust the world around me and the people who are taking care of me. So that issue of trust is huge. And when we start talking about trust building later on, we also encourage people to look back to what was that like when you were young and some of your earlier life experiences. Did you come out of those feeling like you could trust, or maybe not? So another style that gets created is the avoidant, as you mentioned, or she did in her question, which means that primarily you end up moving away and taking care of yourself because you don't have that sense that others will do that for you. And the anxious or ambivalent, sometimes it's called attachment style, is when someone is always pursuing and trying to be with another person to feel that sense of security in their presence. And the last one, I'm spacing a little bit on the name, differentiated, that's not quite right. It's a mixed attachment style of both avoidant and also the ambivalent, where sometimes you're doing one, sometimes you're doing the other. So you get that confusion of both. They say that many children raised in abusive homes end up with this attachment style. So what we're trying to create in our relationships, of course, is a secure attachment style.
Right.
And it is something that we love to see couples developing as they find more safety in their relationships and how to serve one another. Knowing again that like when you move away, it's not really that you don't like me or don't want me there. It's like this is how you have been used to taking care of yourself. And the same thing, your million billion questions, they're not about trying to drive me crazy. I realize you're just in a really anxious spot right now.
Yeah.
So we can learn to create this better attachment when we come together and are able to start talking about some of this.
And I think another principle is the more stress I'm experiencing, the more tendency I have to go back to the old ways of coping. And so what may be true is, as I do my work as an individual and in my relationship, there are certain things that come up that are not that stressful, that we do this new way of connecting. But when I get to that extreme stress or significant stress, it is kind of an unconscious knee-jerk reaction to go back to what I know. And so one of the things that I think is helpful is when we find ourselves falling back into the old patterns, to really try to evaluate how much stress am I experiencing, and then with that information still choose to re-engage the relationship, or in the other case, to create space in the relationship, knowing even if there's distance or disconnection now, I can be safe. But that awareness of, we don't consciously choose this. It may be an old pattern. We have to consciously choose not to fall back into the old pattern.
I think in this process, there are two phrases, they're very short, that I think can be very helpful. The first one is, I'd like to have a different conversation. To even start that way, to acknowledge we have our dance, we can get into these patterns. I really want us to try to have a different conversation. There's something safe and intentional about that. And hopefully that can lead down a good path. The other phrase that I think can be really helpful when maybe we find ourselves in some of the old dance is to say, let's start again. To acknowledge this is heading down an old road. This is starting to feel really familiar. But just that very simple phrase, let's start again. I had a gal in a group just a few weeks ago tell me that she and her husband got sideways, as we all can. And he's the one who said, let's hold on, let's start again. And she said it meant so much to her. She took a breath. They both just were able to exhale for a minute. And they did. They started again and then ended up having a much more meaningful, effective conversation.
And I would say even another thing to add to that might be ownership. We just got done doing some podcasts about ownership and forgiveness, and starting with owning something as well as let's start again. I want to acknowledge that I have been asking you tons of questions and I won't stop talking. And I realize that must be very annoying. That's the ownership. So I really want to sit here and just tell you I'm really lonely. And I would love to feel close to you. And when I do that, I start talking like this. So that would be a way for someone
great.
with that problem to own it and then try to commit to doing that differently. Someone that's trying to, move away all the time and withdraw could own that too, saying, I have this temptation to go get a hotel room for 3 days. I had a client that did that recently. Every time an argument comes up, off they go to a hotel for 3 days. For them just to own that, I don't want to do that. I need a little time to talk with somebody. I will come back and talk with you within this day. So that they know when they're coming back, at least to try it again, may still not go well.
Yeah.
And as we always say, there will be these issues that are so big, no matter how many times you try again, it's not going to go well,
We need
and you
help.
need help.
We need a third
And that's
person.
when we encourage them to get professional help.
Well, and I think part of that ownership is, especially for maybe the withdrawal, is this fear. But I think it's fear for both of them. I'm pursuing you in this anxiety because I'm afraid, and I'm withdrawing because I'm afraid. But even if we start owning our fear, instead of blaming the other person, that creates the space we need to be able to have some of these conversations.
The last thing that I want to say about this, and we can move on. I really like what you just said, Deb, about I need some space and I will come back to you within X amount of time frame. I can appreciate that someone is wanting to take some space if what they know that in the moment they spout off or say really hurtful
Yeah,
things.
I'll say something I'll regret.
Right. That's not a bad practice. What gets painful and hurtful is when it goes on for, a number of days and it's silent.
Yeah,
And
so that makes sense, doesn't it, with the person who has anxious attachment to never know if they're ever going to come back, which is probably not what's going to happen, but that's probably what you're thinking in your head. That creates even more anxiety, and then their coping mechanism to do more of that pressure. So you see how the dance grows. We always say baby steps to start changing that. Hopefully the 3 days moves down to maybe a day, and then maybe moves down to a half a day, and hopefully eventually not so much time, maybe an hour or two.
Right.
So that's our hope in making progress with some of that.
That's great.
And the good news is we have the capacity to create safety for ourselves no matter what our spouse is doing. And so
That's a great point.
a lot of times we feel like, oh, this can only be resolved if my spouse does this, or I can only be safe if my spouse does this. But when we remind ourselves, actually, safety is up to me. I can create safety for myself no matter what circumstances I'm in. Suddenly, I'm releasing my spouse from needing to do something they can't do anyway, and that's create safety for me. And that makes it possible for me at some point maybe to re-engage it in a new way from a place of safety, not a place of anxiety and fear.
Yeah. Great.
And being able to say, I like who I am and how I'm reacting in this situation, even if a spouse has not changed.
Right.
And that's, again, our ideal situation, that all I can change is how I'm going to do my part. And if we only wait to change our part till the other person changes their part, we could be waiting forever. So there's always something we can do to work on liking how we're doing life better.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, great question. All right, so here's the second question, and I just want to say this is also a very good question, and there's so much that could be said about this, so we're going to do our best to give a succinct response. How do we address our caution and hurt regarding sex, and in what ways can we navigate towards healthy sexuality in marriage?
Succinct, you want?
Good luck.
What time will succinct be here?
Succinctly here.
Well, I would start out by saying succinctly. I think it would be helpful to know that you're you have the same vision for healthy sexuality, and what does it even mean to you? I think we find with many of the couples that come to us here, they don't really have a definition even of what healthy sexuality is. That, probably historically it's been that piece in a relationship that has brought them together, as it often does. And we have learned to identify it differently for couples who are here and want to practice what we believe is healthier, more connected sexuality. So our definition is that when you are emotionally and spiritually connected, sexuality becomes an expression of that place. Which means a lot of things could change. It means you don't do makeup sex to get out of an argument. It means if somebody is really thinking about something else, an affair partner, pornography, or whatever. You don't engage in trying to be present with someone else because you would not be emotionally connected with that person. That could happen both ways, by the way, as a couple is working through sexual addiction discovery. Oftentimes, I think you would probably agree, wives' heads are lots of other places other than being in the room sexually too, as they're worried about what their husbands are thinking or whatever information they have about his acting out. Right. So being emotionally connected and spiritually connected may take a time, in this process, and it may be a while before we could really enter into what would be considered healthier sexuality.
Well, and I think part of the challenge is most of us, especially if we grew up in the church, we were given a context in which we were supposed to experience sexuality. It's wait till you're married, husband and wife, and that's it. And so the assumption is, well, if I'm in that context, everything will be okay. Instead of really casting a vision of what I would say is a theology of sexuality, so that I understand the context, but like you're saying, I also have a bigger vision of this being about connection and intimacy. And, the way I talk about intimacy is when I'm known, I'm safe, I'm connected. So sexual intimacy is being known, being safe, and being connected in that sexual space. So it's not just the context, between a husband and wife that are married, but it's this bigger vision of what the experience is supposed to be there once we get there.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think can be really helpful that we talk about quite a bit here at Faithful and True is recognizing that oftentimes we need a team to help us recover. And so what may be true is that a husband and wife, if they're finding difficulty in moving towards healthy emotional connection, healthy spiritual connection, and thus struggling with healthy sexual connection, that they bring this into couples therapy. And they might even find that they need specific help. We often talk something around here called sexual reintegration therapy, SRT. And so that's another way that we can seek help, and there are specialists that do that. There are great books. One of the books that we like a lot around here is Restoring the Pleasure by the Penners, and then The Couple's Guide to Intimacy by the Burkaws. Mm-hmm. Both of those have really good information and exercises. And begin with learning to talk about sexuality, which quite honestly can be very vulnerable for couples. Mm-hmm. And a lot of couples are way more comfortable, quote unquote, having sex rather than talking about it. Mm-hmm. And yet that's part of this emotional intimacy that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And maybe we could just normalize it and say, I can't think of hardly any couples we've ever worked with who have talked about sexuality and been comfortable with that since the beginning of the marriage.
They thought about it a lot, probably.
Yes, yeah.
But healthy discussion about it, where we're, showing up and naming needs, feeling safe about it, that is probably very rare.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think part of it too is we can't be sexually present unless we are able to embrace our sexual past. And so what are the messages that we've been given in the past? What do we believe about our bodies? What do we believe about the sexual experience? What do we believe about our spouse and the other gender, whatever it may be? And so many times, you have the complexity of just sexuality, then you layer in the complexity and pain of sexual betrayal, and also in there is our sexual history and our story. So it makes perfect sense for couples that this is a very complex thing to navigate, and just to be able to talk about it, to be open about it, to get support about it, really can be the first step. But it can be easy to focus on just what has sex been in our marriage and let that be all of the conversation, when those books many times encourage us to get clearer about what is our sexual history, our story, our experiences, and not just what were the experiences, but what were the core beliefs. Right. What did we begin to believe about ourselves and others in sex because of those early experiences that we had?
Yeah. Agreed.
I was saying another complication for many couples, I think, could be about longing for healthy touch, physical touch, non-sexual touch, that especially in our relationships where there's been a sexual addiction, that we haven't really experienced healthy touch that's not sexualized, because typically all touch, I'm sorry, it's the end of the day, isn't it? All touch has been sexualized in some way. In other words, I'm hoping that if you touch me right now, hug me, give me a kiss now, that maybe later then that means you're going to be available for sex. So there is a pressure, I think, that has entered our relationships where we have learned to pull away from just the healthy touch that we believe all of us need, because there's too much energy of sexuality attached to it. For some of our couples, entering back into healthy sexuality has been first of all, straightening out the healthy touch part of things.
Yeah.
And many, many women I work with are so delighted to hear that and to work on that, because they have longed for more touch. And yet they've also known that because when I touch, it doesn't always mean that I want to be sexual. They don't necessarily go together. And so we help couples be intentional about that, which seems kind of middle schoolish, you know,
Right.
is it okay if I hold your hand? And this is not about wanting to be sexual now or anytime soon.
But what complicates sex and touch is when there's an agenda attached to it, and I'm not clear about what that agenda is. There's a suspicion that that we can have, and especially if we've been touched in the past, or we've been sexualized in the past where there was an agenda, we bring that suspicion into the present. And so what may be true is it takes effort and work and clear communication, if there is an agenda, to get honest about that and to own it and let the other person name whether or not they can be a part of that experience. But that feels so awkward to have those conversations. But I often tell couples, if it feels awkward, that's a good indication you're doing something different. And that difference is awkward, and that can be good.
And there's the talking part again.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
You know, so when we're needing to talk about it, that's exactly what we mean. We talk about our expectations and our needs to see if the other person can meet those or not. It's a vulnerable thing, because you could be turned down, you could be rejected, and none of us like that. So.
Well, and it also requires that self-awareness that if I do have an agenda, I'm getting honest with myself about that and communicating it to my spouse. And that can be vulnerable, and so it needs to be a safe space to be able to have those conversations.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate these questions, and shout out to the group members that were willing to
Yes.
submit them. Thank you very much for providing this rich discussion for us.
Well, this is exactly what we had in mind. I appreciate you and Debbie being with us today to answer these questions, because this is there's been a need and a desire to have some podcasts like this, because we know there's plenty of questions out there, and we'd love to address those for our listeners. So we'd like to thank you for having joined us today. We'd like to thank Beth Miller and Debbie Laaser for taking part in today's podcast. We invite you again, if you have any questions, to submit them to us at info@faithfulandtrue.com. info@faithfulandtrue.com. We'd also like to invite you to view our YouTube Faithful and True channel, subscribe, and click the like button. We'd like that very much. We appreciate your support, and we hope that next week when you join us, that you will have had a week that was filled with many blessings and with great vision.